Hello everyone, and welcome back to Unsaid Hours. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. My father is not a man who tells stories for effect. He has no interest in being believed in the way that people who embellish have an interest in being believed. When he talks about something that happened, he talks about it the way a person talks about a thing they witnessed and cannot unwitness, with a kind of flat, careful precision that comes not from rehearsal, but from the weight of a memory that has been turned over so many times that all the unnecessary parts have worn away, and only the true shape remains. He told me this story once. He asked me not to name the people in it or the place where it happened. Not out of embarrassment, he was clear about that. Out of something closer to respect, or caution, or the particular reluctance of a person who has carried a thing quietly for decades and is not entirely sure what happens when you give it too much air. He was around 12 years old. Summer, the kind of long, unstructured day that children of that era knew in a way that is difficult to explain now. Hours that belonged entirely to themselves, with no particular destination and no particular agenda beyond the occupation of the time. He and his closest friend decided to go fishing at the river near where they lived. They had done it before, many times. Enough that the river had become one of those places that exists in the background of a childhood, familiar and unremarkable, as ordinary as a backyard. A wooden dock, slow-moving water, the kind of peaceful atmosphere that makes a place feel like nothing bad has ever happened there. So they brought their rods and baited the hooks and cast their lines. Then, because they were 12 and the afternoon was long and sitting still waiting for a fish was less appealing than doing something while waiting, they chained the rods to the dock so they wouldn't be dragged in by a hard strike, and they wandered a short distance down the sandy shore. This was not unusual. They had done it before. You secure the line, you give yourself room to move. You come back when something pulls. What happened next began as so many things that cannot be explained begin as something intentionally meaningless. One of them suggested, in the way bored children suggest things, that they do a summoning ritual for fish, a joke, a piece of theater with no audience but themselves, and no stakes beyond the entertainment of the next few minutes. They were not children who believed in anything supernatural. They were 12, fishing on a familiar river on an ordinary afternoon, and the ritual was the kind of thing that comes from too much imagination and not enough to do. They drew shapes in the sand, rough and approximate, copied from some half-remembered image, from a comic or a movie or the general cultural sediment of childhood. They stood over the shapes and made sounds that were meant to be a chant, and they laughed at themselves while they did it. Because of course they did, because it was a joke and they knew it was a joke, and there was nothing in either of their lives that had suggested the world was the kind of place where jokes like this had consequences. Then they finished, and the laughter settled and one of the rods snapped tight. The speed of it was wrong. That was the first thing, before any other detail, before any attempt to understand what was happening. The speed was wrong. Not the speed of a fish taking a hook, not the measured resistance of a living thing responding to being caught. The line went from slack to savagely taut in an instant, the rod bowing hard against the chain that held it to the dock, and then the hook tore free and the line snapped, and the surface of the river was calm, undisturbed, as if nothing was there. They had both fished enough times to know what a fish looked like on a line, the way a large one fought, the rhythm of it, the splashing, the lateral movement, the way the water responded to the weight and panic of something alive and resisting. This was none of those things. The force had come straight down and then gone, straight down and then upstream, against the current, and the water above it had not moved. The second rod went before either of them had spoken. The same force traveling upstream from where the first hook had been taken hit the second line with the same sudden violence, the same absence of visible cause, the same clean snap, and then nothing. The river was still. The surface reflected the sky. Whatever had moved through it had left no evidence of itself except two severed lines hanging limp from the dock, and two boys standing on the shore who had stopped making any sound at all. My father told me they waited. They stood there watching the water, expecting something to surface, expecting the ordinary explanation to present itself. The large fish rolling to the top, the dark shape visible beneath the shallows. Anything that the world they understood could produce to account for what had just happened. The water gave them nothing. It stayed calm in a way that was itself wrong, that communicated an absence of disturbance more complete than any disturbance should have allowed. He said they did not discuss it in any real way. There were no theories exchanged, no attempts to talk each other into a reasonable explanation. They gathered what they had, and they left, walking quickly, not running, because running would have meant acknowledging fully what they were feeling, and acknowledging it fully was something neither of them was ready to do. They glanced back at the river more than once on the way home. The feeling of being watched, without any visible watcher, without any sound or movement from the direction of the water. Just the feeling, persistent and sourceless, following them down the path. The years passed the way years pass, burying things under the ordinary accumulations of a life. My father grew up, moved through the stages of adulthood, became a person with distance from the child he had been on that riverbank. But the memory did not fade in the way that most childhood memories fade. It kept its clarity. He and his friend talked about it sometimes across the years, returning to it the way two people return to a shared experience that has never been fully resolved, hoping that the accumulated perspective of age might finally offer them something. It never did. The event stayed exactly what it had been on the day it happened, sharp and complete and without explanation. He told me this story in a room we were sharing, just the two of us, one evening. The telling was quiet and deliberate, the way he told things, no dramatization, no reaching for effect. He spoke like a man giving a witness account rather than a man telling a story, and I listened the way you listen when you understand that the person speaking is not trying to entertain you, but to give you something they have been holding for a long time. He was partway through when the smell arrived. It came without transition, without the gradual build of an odor seeping in from somewhere. It was simply not there, and then it was, filling the room with a completeness that left no part of the air untouched. I have tried to describe this smell to myself many times in the years since, and I have never found a description that feels adequate. The closest I can come is this. Imagine the smell of something deeply biological and wrong, of decay and sulfur combined, of something that should not exist in a living space existing there fully and without apology. It was not faint. It was not the kind of thing you wonder if you are imagining. It was present in the way that very few things are present, demanding attention, impossible to set aside. We both reacted at the same moment, which was itself significant. There was no question of whether one of us was perceiving something the other wasn't. We looked at each other and we both knew that we were in the same experience, and then we started looking for the source. We checked the bathroom, we checked the vents, we checked the corners of the room, our own clothes, the space under the furniture. We moved around the room systematically, the way rational people respond to a problem they expect to find a rational solution to. But the smell did not behave like a smell with a source. It moved, not dramatically, not in a way that could be tracked, but it shifted as we moved through the room, never strongest in any one place, never absent from any other. as if it were being carried by something that was also moving, something that occupied the space with us but was not fixed to it. I watched my father's face change as we searched. He was not a man who frightened easily, and what I saw was not exactly fear, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The look of a person who has encountered something before and has spent years hoping not to encounter it again, and is now confronted with the possibility that it has found him. He went quiet. Then he said he was going to pray. He was not a particularly religious man in the daily sense. He believed, but he held it privately and lightly, without ceremony, without the kind of active practice that makes faith visible. But something in that room at that moment moved him to something older and more instinctive than his ordinary relationship with belief. He began to recite prayers, things he had learned as a child and retained somewhere below the level of regular use, his voice steady and serious, not performing the act for my benefit, but doing it because he had decided it was the thing that needed to be done. I watched the room and said nothing. The smell left, not gradually, not in the way that an odor disperses when a window is opened, thinning at the edges until it becomes bearable and then nothing. It stopped. Between one moment and the next, the air in that room was ordinary, clean, unremarkable, carrying no trace of what had been so insistently present the moment before. The transition was absolute and without physical explanation, and we both felt it with the same completeness with which we had both felt the smell arrive. We stood in the silence afterward for a while. Neither of us moved immediately to check again, because there was nothing left to check. There was no source to find, because there was no longer anything there. The room was simply a room. My father looked shaken in a way I had not seen before. Not undone, not the shaking of a person who has lost their footing entirely. More like someone who has received a confirmation they did not want and cannot now unreceive. He had told this story to very few people over the course of his life. He had carried it carefully and privately, turning it over across decades. And now, in the act of telling it, something had happened that felt, regardless of what it actually was, like a response. I have thought about what to do with all of this for years, not in a consuming way, not as something that dominates my thinking, but in the background, in the way that unresolved things occupy background space in a mind that has not found a container for them. I do not know what moved through that river. I have considered the ordinary explanations. The large fish moving so powerfully that it snapped two lines in quick succession, the current doing something unusual that mimicked deliberate force. I consider these, and I hold them against what my father described, against the details that resist them most stubbornly. The upstream movement against the current, the absolutely undisturbed water, the precise sequence. The explanations do not fit without bending the details into shapes they were not reported in, and my father is not a man who bends details. I do not know what filled that room with a smell, and then removed it in the space between one breath and the next. I do not know what it means that these two things exist in the same story, connected by nothing except my father's memory of a joke made on a riverbank by a child who did not believe the joke could reach anything. What I know is what I witnessed, a man who does not tell stories for effect, telling one that had cost him something to carry, and a room that responded to the telling in a way that has no explanation I am satisfied with. I know the smell was real because I smelled it. I know the absence was real because I was there when it arrived. I think about those two boys on the shore, me watching the water for something that never surfaced, standing in a silence that had gone wrong, gathering their things and walking away quickly without talking, glancing back at a river that looked exactly as it always had, as if nothing had moved through it, as if nothing was still there. Water holds no record of what passes through it. It closes over and returns to itself and gives nothing back to the surface. Whatever took those hooks that afternoon left no sign, no shape, no evidence that could be held or named or taken home. Only the memory, which is what everything leaves in the end, in the people who were present for it, sharp and intact and without resolution, waiting to be carried forward into rooms where other people are sleeping, and the night is quiet, and the air is, for the moment, perfectly still. The house I grew up in was the kind of place that seemed perfectly ordinary in daylight. A rural road, the kind where cars pass maybe twice an hour if you're lucky, and the gaps between neighbors were wide enough that you couldn't see their porch lights from our windows at night. It felt peaceful during the day. Trees, open space, the particular quiet of the countryside that people in cities pay money to visit. But the house had a feature that I never thought twice about when I was young, because when you grow up with something, it just becomes part of the architecture of your life. It becomes normal. My bedroom was in a section of the house that sat right up against an attached shed. Not a detached outbuilding you'd have to cross a yard to reach, but something that was part of the structure itself, sharing a wall, sharing a roof. And the way the house was built, there was a set of glass doors in my room that opened directly into that shed. 2 panes of glass and a metal handle and a thin lock, and on the other side of them was a space full of tools and shadows and cold air that smelled like motor oil and rust. I never thought about those doors as a vulnerability. They were just doors. I had probably opened them 100 times as a younger child to peek inside, and nothing bad had ever been on the other side, so my brain filed them away as neutral, background, part of the room the same way the walls were part of the room. I was 12, maybe just turned 13, sometime in 2002 when I first heard the footsteps. It started small, the way these things do when they are building toward something that hasn't happened yet. A sound late at night, after my parents had gone to bed and the house had gone quiet. Footsteps in the shed, not loud, not dramatic, just the soft, irregular creak and scrape of weight, moving on a wooden floor just beyond the glass. The first time I heard it, I told myself it was the house settling. Old houses do that. They expand and contract with the temperature. They shift. They groan in ways that sound almost human if you're tired enough and the room is dark enough. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The second night, I heard it again. By the third or fourth night, I had started watching the doors instead of sleeping. I would lie in bed with the covers pulled up and stare at the glass panes and wait. The shed was dark. I couldn't see much of anything, but sometimes when a cloud shifted or the moon was in the right position, there was just enough ambient light to make out shapes. And one night, while I was lying there watching, I saw it. A figure, moving back and forth in the darkness on the other side of the glass. Not running, not crouched, just walking, slowly, back and forth, the way a person walks when they are waiting for something or working up to something. The shape of a person, unhurried in my shed, in the middle of the night, just feet from where I was lying. I flew out of bed and down the hall to my parents' room. My mom got up with me, my dad too, eventually, grumbling in the way parents do when they've been dragged out of sleep for the third or fourth time. They went into the shed with a flashlight and I waited in the hallway, listening. After a few minutes, they came back. Nothing. No one there. The doors were latched from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no footprints they could clearly identify, nothing out of place that couldn't be explained by the ordinary disorder of a tool shed. My dad said it was an animal, or the wind, or my imagination. He said it with the flat certainty of someone who had already decided which answer he preferred. I went back to my room. A week later, I woke them up again, and then again after that. Each time, the same result. Empty shed. Nothing there. My dad's patience, which had never been a vast resource, was wearing down to something harder. I could see it in the way he got up, in the set of his shoulders, in the shortness of his words. He was a man who needed his sleep and believed in practical explanations. And I was a child who kept insisting something was wrong in a place where he could find no evidence of anything being wrong. One night, after yet another trip to his room, after yet another fruitless sweep of the shed, he slapped me across the face. Not a beating, not something prolonged, just one sharp, flat-handed slap, the kind that communicates frustration more than punishment, the kind that leaves no mark but stays with you anyway. He told me I was being dramatic. He told me to go to sleep and stop waking people up. I went back to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark and pressed my hand against my cheek and felt something settle in me that I didn't have a name for at the time. It wasn't just the sting or the humiliation. It was something more like the closing of a door, the understanding that I was alone in this, that whatever was happening on the other side of those glass panes, I was going to have to manage it by myself. Because the people who were supposed to believe me had decided not to. I stopped going to their room after that. Not because the noises stopped, but because there was no longer any point. Instead, I started building small defenses. I pushed my bed across the room until it sat flush against the glass doors, the frame pressed against them, the weight of it as a kind of barricade. If someone tried to open those doors, they would have to push against my bed first, and that small delay felt like the difference between helpless and not quite helpless. I found a piece of scrap rebar somewhere around the property, thick and heavy and cold, and I put it under the mattress where I could reach it quickly. I didn't know what I would do with it if it came to that. I was 13, but holding it in the dark felt like something, a small declaration that I was not entirely without options. The figure kept coming, 3 nights a week, sometimes 4, sometimes more, always late, always after the house had gone fully quiet. I would hear the footsteps in the shed, and I would lie perfectly still and wait. And sometimes I would see the shape moving through the glass. Sometimes I would hear the handle of the glass doors being tested. Not aggressively, not rattling and shaking, but slowly, carefully, the kind of testing that is patient and methodical and somehow worse than something frantic. A slow, deliberate pull, a pause, another pull. The behavior of someone who was not in a hurry because they had all the time they needed. Every time I switched on my bedside lamp, the sounds would stop. Every time I shone a flashlight toward the glass, the shape would pull back into the deeper dark of the shed and disappear. So I started sleeping with the lamp on, which meant I barely slept at all, and which meant the circles under my eyes got darker, and my attention in school got thinner, and my temper got shorter, and I started to look, from the outside, like a child who was struggling in ways that had no obvious cause. And then came the doubt. That was the worst part of all of it. Worse than the fear, worse than the sleeplessness, worse than the slap. After months of being told nothing was there, after months of finding empty shed and no evidence, and the same patient adult faces explaining reality back to me, I began to wonder if they were right. Fear can look like imagination when you're tired enough. When something happens repeatedly and no one around you can confirm it, the gap between real and not real starts to blur. I would lie in bed after hearing the footsteps and think, maybe it is an animal, maybe it is the house, maybe I am the problem, maybe I am the thing that needs to be fixed. That quiet internal erosion was its own kind of damage, separate from whatever else was happening just beyond the glass. 6 months in, on an ordinary school day in the middle of the week, my dad came to pick me up early. He didn't explain much on the drive home, just that we needed to talk to the police when we got there. My first reaction, I am a little ashamed to admit now, was that I was in trouble. My brain, worn down by months of poor sleep and self-doubt, went immediately to the most self-punishing explanation it could find. I thought I was being arrested, for lying, for causing trouble. For all those nights I had woken people up. When we turned onto our road and I saw the police cars outside the house, multiple of them, lights off but official and unmistakable in the driveway, I felt my stomach drop through the seat. My mom met us outside and pulled me away from the cars and talked to me quietly until I stopped shaking. She explained what had happened that morning. My dad had gone into the shed to get some tools, a chainsaw he needed, some electrical equipment. He had noticed, with the particular sharpness of someone who knows where things belong, that several items were missing. Expensive things that didn't just wander off. He called the police and then, while waiting, mentioned it to a neighbor the way you do in rural areas when something goes wrong, as both a warning and a reaching out. The neighbor's response was not what my dad expected. The man went quiet in the specific way of someone who already knows the answer to the question being asked. He said his son might have taken the tools. He said they had a problem with him, with money, with drugs, with choices that kept getting worse. He asked my dad not to call the police. He said they would pay for everything. He said, please. My dad said no. He wanted answers more than he wanted money. The police went to the neighbor's house and they searched the son's room. What they found there was the moment when everything that had been one kind of story became a completely different kind of story. They found the stolen tools, yes. They found evidence of drug use, but they also found photographs. Some of them were school photos of me, the kind that come in small wallet-sized prints, the kind that get sent home in envelopes and end up in frames on relatives' walls. Someone had taken those photos. They had no business being in that room. And alongside them were other photographs, photographs taken on our property, photographs that captured angles and distances that only made sense if the person taking them had been close. Very close. Some of them were taken at night. Some of them showed the interior of my bedroom through the glass doors. He had been there. Not an animal, not the house settling, not my imagination unraveling in the dark. A person, a neighbor's son, someone I had probably seen before, probably passed on the road or at the end of a driveway, someone who existed in the ordinary background of rural life and had been using that ordinariness as cover. He had been in the shed, in the dark, on the other side of those glass doors, 3 and 4 nights a week for 6 months. The police believed he had started stealing tools as a secondary behavior, something opportunistic added on top of the original reason he was coming. The tools were not why he was there. He was there before the tools became interesting to him. When I understood that, when the full shape of it became clear, I felt something I don't have a clean word for. Not just fear, not just relief, not just the particular exhaustion of being proven right after being so thoroughly told you were wrong. It was more physical than any of those things. A cold, spreading interior sensation, like swallowing something made of ice. All those nights I had pushed my bed against those doors. All those nights I had held the piece of rebar in the dark and listened to the handle being tested slowly, patiently, by someone who was waiting for a night when the light didn't come on, who had photographs, who had been building something in his head about me across 6 months of standing outside my glass doors in the dark. What he had been building, I still don't let myself think about for very long. The thoughts are too heavy, too specific, too close to something that didn't happen only because of the particular luck of me being a light sleeper, of the bed pressed against the door, of the lamp I started leaving on. Small things, fragile things, the kind of things that could just as easily have gone the other way on any given night. My parents were devastated in the way that people are devastated when they realized the error they made was not a small one. They had dismissed me. They had made me feel crazy for telling the truth. My dad had slapped me for being afraid of something real. They apologized repeatedly for months, and I could see that the apologies were genuine, that they were sitting with something heavy that wasn't going to lift easily. Even now, years removed from all of it, they carry that. I tease them about it sometimes, carefully, the way you handle something that has healed but left a tender place. I never went to court. The police recorded me on video, me recounting everything in the order it had happened, and that recording was enough for the purposes of the case. I didn't want to sit in a room and look at him. I still don't know what happened to him legally, what sentence was given or served, what his life looks like now. I made a deliberate decision not to find out. I hope he got help. I hope the specific thing he had been building toward in his head over those 6 months never found another target. That is the most generous version of what I hope, and on good days I manage it. After everything settled, after the police cars left and the shed was searched and the photographs were evidence, and my bedroom stopped being the place where I was alone with something I couldn't prove, my parents did something small and unexpected. They let me get mice, pet mice, which I had been asking about for a while, which had previously been a no without much discussion. I think they needed to do something kind for me, needed to make an offering. And the mice were what they could give. One of them was named Paprika, Pappy for short. He was small and rust-colored and completely unbothered by the world, and I kept him for 6 years, which is an unusual amount of time for a mouse, and which felt meaningful in ways I couldn't articulate when I was 13, but can almost articulate now. Taking care of him gave me something to do with my hands in the early mornings, when I woke up too early and the quiet felt wrong. He would come to the side of the cage when I put my finger against the bars, and he was warm and alive and present in the specific way that small animals are, without agenda, without the complicated weight of human interaction. He was the reason I eventually understood I wanted to work with animals. Not in a sudden revelation, but slowly, the way most real things unfold. One ordinary morning at a time. The memory of that period still lives close to the surface, even now. Not loud, not dramatic. It arrives quietly, in the way that the most stubborn memories do, when I see glass doors, or hear an unfamiliar sound at night, or watch a child try to explain something that an adult has already decided isn't real. It arrives as a reminder of what it costs when fear gets labeled as imagination, when a child's testimony is weighed against the absence of visible evidence and found wanting. It arrives as a reminder that the most frightening things are not always the ones that announce themselves. Sometimes the most frightening thing is just a shape, patient and quiet, on the other side of the glass. The house I grew up in existed before I did, which is obvious and unremarkable in the way that most obvious things are until they aren't. Every house has a life before its current occupants. Rooms that held other furniture, walls that absorbed other conversations, thresholds crossed by people who are now gone. I never thought about that as a child. It was simply home, familiar in every corner, safe in the particular way that childhood homes are safe, before you develop the vocabulary to understand that safety is not a permanent condition of a place, but something that gets constructed and sometimes quietly undermined. My mother told me the first story so many times that it settled into my memory as though I had been present for it, which I had not. I was not yet born. She was young, playing inside the house with my cousin, who was 2 or 3 at the time, young enough that the world was still mostly sensation and response without much in the way of narrative between them. They were doing something simple, tossing something back and forth, the kind of easy, repetitive play that fills the hours of a child's afternoon without requiring names or rules. The house was calm. It was the middle of the day. There was nothing in any direction that suggested anything other than an ordinary hour. My mother threw the object down the hallway and my cousin ran after it. She waited, A few seconds passed, perhaps longer, the kind of pause that registers only because of what came after it. Then he came running back, not trotting, not walking quickly, running, with the full body commitment of a small child who has encountered something his body wants distance from before his mind has finished identifying it. And he was screaming, not crying, not the ordinary complaint of a toddler who has bumped into something or been startled by a sound. Screaming in the specific register of pure fear, the kind that a child that age produces when something has reached past their limited understanding of the world and touched something beneath it. She grabbed him. She held him and tried to slow him down enough to understand what had happened. And through the crying and the gasping, he told her, an old man, standing at the door. She went to the front door immediately, still holding him, and opened it. The street was empty, not the emptiness of a place where someone has recently left, where you expect to see a retreating figure or hear fading footsteps, simply empty, as if nothing had been there at all. She stepped outside and looked in both directions, and there was no one, no sound of movement, no explanation. She checked the side of the house, checked around the doorway, and found nothing that could account for what he had seen. Eventually, she made herself accept the child's explanation that was easiest to live with, that he had seen a shadow, that he had frightened himself, that the imagination of a 2-year-old was a vivid and unreliable instrument. But the fear on his face stayed with her. She told my father that evening. His reaction was not what she expected. She had anticipated dismissal, a practical explanation offered quickly, the comfortable rationalism of a person who has not been frightened and therefore has no investment in taking the frightening seriously. Instead, he went quiet. Not the quiet of a person thinking of what to say, but the heavier quiet of a person dealing with something they had been carrying privately and had now been given a reason to set down. He told her, after a moment, that he thought he had seen an old man too, just the other day. The air in that room must have changed. My mother told me that she felt it change, that the space between those words and whatever came next had a weight to it that she remembered clearly even decades later. Then my father added, a beat too quickly, that he meant he had seen an old man in the mirror. A reflection misread, his own face caught at an angle. His own features assembled into something unfamiliar for a fraction of a second before resolving back into himself. He said it with a small laugh, the way you package something that is not quite a joke inside the shape of one. She told me she never believed that explanation, not because my father was a dishonest man, but because of the pause before it, because of the quiet that preceded it, the quality of which was not the quiet of someone constructing a story, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of the truth to offer. I grew up in that house knowing none of this. Children are not given the full inventory of a place when they arrive in it. You inhabit the surface of things, and the history lives underneath, and the two rarely intersect in any way that is legible until you are old enough to know what questions to ask. The house never felt frightening to me. It felt like home, which is a specific feeling that has more to do with repetition and familiarity than with the actual character of a place. I moved through its rooms the way you move through spaces that have become extensions of your own body, without attention, without interrogation. I was 13 when the next thing happened. My sister was 10. It was a day like most of the days we spent in those woods. Unremarkable in its beginning, one of dozens of bike rides we had taken through paths we knew well enough that the riding required almost no thought. The woods were a serious part of our childhood, the way woods are when they border the house you grow up in, when they are the place you go when you need to be somewhere that isn't indoors but also isn't fully the world. We knew which paths went where, which ones looped back and which ones went deep enough that the sound of roads and houses disappeared completely. That day we rode deeper than usual, not out of a deliberate decision, but the way rides sometimes extend themselves when the weather is right and neither person is in a hurry to stop. We followed a path that went into a quieter part of the woods, further from the road, the trees growing denser and the light shifting toward the greener, more filtered quality of a place that doesn't see much direct sun. There was a bench. I noticed it because it was wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when they exist where they have no business existing. Not near a road, not near a clearing, not in a spot where a person would naturally stop for a view or a rest. It sat against the trees in a part of the path that had no obvious purpose for sitting, no reason for pausing, nothing to look at that would recommend itself to a person who had brought something to draw in and chosen this particular spot to do it. And on the bench sat an old man doing exactly that. Drawing. Head bent over whatever was on his paper, completely still, completely absorbed, as calm and self-contained as a person who has been somewhere for a long time and expects to be there for a long time still. He did not look frightening. I want to be precise about that. He had the appearance of someone entirely harmless, someone old enough to be a grandfather, doing something solitary and quiet. He looked as though he belonged there, which was the strange part, because nothing about the location suggested that anyone should belong there. My sister fell off her bike before I had finished forming an impression of him. It was not the kind of fall that comes from a rock in the path or a root catching a tire. It was the kind that happens when the body has already decided to stop before the mind has caught up. The abrupt, total loss of forward intention that produces a fall rather than a controlled stop. She hit the ground hard and started crying immediately, but the crying had the wrong quality for the fall. It was too high, too immediate, the wrong kind of sound for a skinned knee. She got up and she ran. Not toward me, not stopping to collect her bike or her shoes, or to look at where she had fallen. She ran in the direction of home, with the full commitment of someone who has finished being in a place and cannot leave it fast enough. I watched her go. Then I turned back to the old man. He had not moved, had not looked up at the sound of the fall or the crying or the running. He was still bent over his drawing, still entirely contained in whatever he was making, as though nothing had happened in his immediate vicinity at all. I remember thinking this was odd without knowing precisely why it was odd. A child falls and cries loudly a few feet from where you are sitting, and you do not look up. You do not check. You continue your drawing as though the world around you has produced nothing worth acknowledging. I collected my sister's bike and her shoes and went home. She had calmed down by the time I got back, the way children calm down after something has passed through them, the surface going still before you can determine what moved beneath it. Later, when we were talking with our parents, I mentioned the old man casually, the way you mention something you have no reason to think is significant. I said something about how it must be pleasant for him, sitting in the woods and drawing, the kind of offhand comment that assumes a shared understanding of who you're talking about. My sister's response was strange in a way I filed away without fully examining at the time. She was dismissive of the comment, not interested in discussing the old man or the bench, and her dismissiveness had a particular quality to it, not ignorance but avoidance, the behavior of someone who knows what you are talking about and has decided not to engage with it. My father looked confused. I assumed he was joking. He had a dry humor, the kind that expressed itself through pretended ignorance, and I thought this was that. I moved on. Years went by. The memory existed in that middle distance where things that haven't yet resolved themselves as significant wait to be either forgotten or retrieved. I retrieved it eventually. I asked my father in adulthood, expecting him to smile and admit the joke. He didn't smile. He told me he hadn't been joking. He said he remembered the bike ride, remembered my sister coming home upset, could account for the afternoon in other ways. But he was clear and straightforward and unambiguous when he said he had not seen an old man on a bench. He said it the way a person states a fact they have no reason to doubt, without defensiveness. Without the particular quality of a person maintaining a position. He simply had not seen him. He had been on the path, and there had been no bench and no old man on it. And he was certain of this in the uncomplicated way of someone reporting what their eyes had told them. I thought about his certainty for a long time afterward. Several years ago, as an adult with a dog who needed a longer walk than usual, I went back. It was not a deliberate investigation, not something I had planned. I just took a longer route and found myself on the familiar path, moving through the same trees, covering the same ground. The woods had changed in the small ways that woods change over decades. Subtle variations in density, paths slightly altered by seasons and foot traffic, but the fundamental geography was intact and recognizable. Now I knew the spot when I was approaching it, not because of any clear marker, but because the body remembers in ways the mind cannot always articulate. A slight shift in attention as you get close to a place that has meant something, even if you haven't thought about it in years. There was no bench. I stopped and looked at the place where it had been, where I was certain it had been. Old trees stood there, their roots thick and spread wide, undisturbed. Not the roots of trees that have grown around something, not the pattern of growth that adapts to the presence of an object over decades. Just roots, old and uninterrupted, pressing through the soil in the way they press when nothing has ever occupied their space. I walked the path in both directions, checking spots nearby, applying the logic of a faulty memory that might have shifted the location by 10 feet or 20. I gave myself every opportunity to be wrong about where I was standing. The trees were everywhere the bench should have been, not recently grown, not newly planted, old, settled, established in the way that takes longer than my lifetime. I stood there with my dog pulling at the leash, and I did the accounting. My cousin, before I existed, screaming about an old man at a door that opened onto an empty street. My father going quiet before constructing an explanation that my mother never believed. An old man on a bench in the woods, calm and still, while a child fell and screamed and ran. My father, who had been on the same path, who had seen none of it. A return, decades later, to a place where the physical evidence refused to support what I remembered. I don't have a framework that contains all of these things simultaneously without leaving gaps. I've tried. You try in the same way you try to hold an optical illusion in both of its states at once. The vase and the faces, neither one staying stable long enough to become the only truth. It doesn't hold. Something keeps shifting out of place. What I am left with is the image of an old man drawing in a quiet part of the woods, unhurried and unbothered, sitting on a bench in a place where no bench could have been, his head bent over his paper with the patience of something that has been in a particular spot for a very long time and is not expecting to leave. My dog pulled at the leash, and I walked away from those trees and back toward the road. Behind me, the woods were quiet in the way that woods are quiet when there is nothing in them, or in the way that woods are quiet when whatever is in them is not currently making itself known. I have never been fully certain which of those it was that afternoon. I'm still not certain now. There are moments that arrive without warning and insert themselves permanently into the structure of a life. Not the ones you see coming, not the ones that announce themselves with any ceremony. The ones that begin as ordinary afternoons and end as things you carry for the rest of your time, heavy and unresolved, surfacing without invitation in quiet moments years later. That drive across the dam in southern Idaho was one of those moments for me, and I have thought about it more times than I can count, and I have never found a version of the ending that gives me peace. It was about 10 years ago. I was with a close friend, driving across a 2-mile dam that stretched straight and exposed between reservoirs, water on both sides. The road narrow and open to the sky in a way that gave you the feeling of being briefly suspended between two large things. The dam was not an unusual place to be. Locals used it often. People ran along it, fished from its edges, brought their children to look at the water. It had the casual familiarity of a place that has been ordinary for long enough that people stopped noticing it. I had driven it before. It was just a road. The day was clear. The drive was quiet. My friend and I were talking about something I no longer remember, the easy, half-attentive conversation of two people comfortable enough with each other that silence and speech alternate without requiring management. The water was flat on both sides. The road ahead was straight. Then I saw her. She was running along the right shoulder, the narrow one, the side where the pavement barely extended before it met the low barrier at the dam's edge. Cars traveled that road at reasonable speed, the kind of speed that becomes dangerous when there is almost no buffer between moving traffic and a person on foot. My first thought was the practical one, that she had chosen the wrong side, that she might not realize how exposed she was, that she would cross over when she noticed. People made small errors of judgment on familiar roads. It seemed like something with an easy explanation. But as we got closer, the explanation dissolved. She was not jogging in the loose, rhythmic way of someone out for exercise. Her body was tense in a way I felt before I could articulate it. The particular tightness of a person who is holding themselves together through an effort of will rather than moving through space freely. And she was crying. Not the kind of crying that you notice at a distance because someone is covering their face or has slowed their pace. Fully crying, her body carrying it openly, her movements frantic and uncontained in a way that did not belong to an afternoon run. I had already started to slow the car before she turned. She threw herself in front of us. I do not mean that she stepped into our lane. I mean that she turned and threw her body onto the hood of my car with enough force that the impact registered through the steering wheel, through the seat, through my hands and arms, and into the part of me that responds to sudden physical events before thought has assembled itself. She hit the hood and screamed at me to stop, and I was already braking, already stopped, my heart running ahead of everything else, the car still and the world suddenly very close and very loud. Before I had found any words, she came around to the passenger side. She yanked the door open with the urgency of someone who has made a decision and is executing it without allowing herself space to reconsider, and she climbed in. The car was a 1990 Mazda, low and small, a 2-door with a cramped interior, and she pressed herself onto the seat, on top of my friend, without any apparent awareness of the logistics of what she was doing. She was shaking. Her voice when she told me to drive was barely a voice at all, more like breath that had been shaped into words through sheer necessity. I drove. Neither of us asked why yet. There are moments where the body understands the shape of a situation before the mind has the information to justify that understanding, and this was one of them. The way she had come off that road and into the car told us everything we needed to know about whether we should be moving or staying still. We moved. After a few seconds, when she had pulled one breath and then another, my friend and I began to ask her gently if she was okay, what had happened, what she needed. That was when I registered her shirt. It was white, or it had been white. Large sections of it were soaked dark with blood, the kind of staining that comes from something ongoing rather than a single injury, spread and irregular. the evidence of a body that had been hurt and continued to be hurt over time. My grip on the steering wheel changed without my choosing it. She told us in pieces, breathing through the telling. She had been in the car with her boyfriend. He had been beating her. She had jumped out while it was moving. He still had their children with him. The dam stretched ahead of us, flat and exposed, and I kept driving and felt the information settle into the space around us and change the quality of everything. The water on both sides, the narrow road, the open sky. 15 minutes to the nearest town. She asked us to take her there. We said we would. My friend said something quiet and reassuring, and I kept my eyes on the road and did not allow myself to think further ahead than the next 100 yards. When we reached the end of the dam, she asked to move to the back seat to make some calls. We stopped briefly. She climbed back, and I pulled out again. Less than a minute had passed when she shouted. I looked in the mirror before she finished the sentence. There was a car behind us on the dam. The distance between us and it was wrong, closing faster than distance closes when someone is simply driving. It was moving with the specific momentum of a vehicle being pushed as hard as it will go by a person who has one purpose, and it was covering the open stretch of the dam in the particular way of something that has no intention of stopping. I pressed the accelerator. The car I was driving was not built for this. It was an old Mazda, small and low, with the kind of engine that performs adequately on a normal day and reveals its limits on a day like this one. The road climbed toward a hill, and my speed climbed with it, past what I was comfortable with, past what felt safe. The needle moving into territory I had no previous experience navigating, while a frightened woman breathed in my back seat, and my friend sat rigidly silent, and the car behind us filled more of my mirror with every second. He caught us before the hill. He tried to pass on the incline. This is the detail that I still find difficult to process when I revisit it, the straightforward recklessness of it, because there was oncoming traffic on that hill, visible, coming downhill toward us, and he pulled out anyway. He pulled out and then, at the last possible moment, pulled back behind us, the gap between his car and the oncoming traffic, a thing measured in fractions of seconds rather than feet. And then he floored it again as the road leveled at the top. We were going over 80. I know this because I looked at the gauge and then immediately looked away, because looking away from the gauge was the better use of my attention. The road was no longer the road I had driven before, familiar and unremarkable. It had become something narrow and serious, demanding everything I had, and what I had was not enough for the situation. He pulled in front of me. The brake lights of his car came on without warning, the red of them filling my windshield, and I had no time for anything deliberate. I swerved. The wheels went briefly onto the shoulder, and I felt the car slip from under me in that specific way that communicates that you are no longer fully in control of the machine you are sitting in. And then somehow the road came back. The wheels found pavement, and we stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then he was out of his car. He was screaming before his door was fully open, the sound of it arriving ahead of him, raw and directionless, in the way of rage that has passed the point of having an object and become simply a condition. He was pointing at the back seat, at her, demanding she come out, demanding she bring herself back to him, and the words he used and the way he used them told me more about what those children had been riding in that car with than any single detail from the story she had told us. She was crying again. She looked at us, and she looked at the other car, the back seat of which held her children, and I watched something tear in her face as she made the calculation that she was going to keep making for years. The one that weighed her own safety against the safety of her children and arrived at the same answer every time. She opened the door and got out. We asked her. We asked her if she wanted us to stay, if she wanted us to call someone, if there was anything left that we could do. She told us to leave. She said, "Please don't call the police." And the plea in it was the plea of someone who has learned from experience that a certain kind of help makes things worse. And I did not know how to argue with that knowledge from inside the car I was sitting in. She went to his car and opened the back door, and her children were there, and she put her arms around them and held on. I could see this through my windshield, and I did not look away. He was still shouting at her now, at us, gesturing for us to go. And she turned once and looked back at us, and the look on her face was not simple. It was not just fear or gratitude or the blankness of someone shut down by adrenaline. It was complicated in the specific way that situations are complicated when the person in the middle of them understands things about their situation that no one on the outside can fully understand. She motioned for us to leave. I drove. My friend and I did not speak for a while. There was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying more accurately. I drove until I found a farmhouse about a mile down the road, and I pulled in because I needed to stop, needed to put the car in park and let my hands come off the wheel, needed to breathe in a place that was not moving. We went inside and called the police. We gave them everything we had. The make and description of the car, the direction, the time, the location, her physical description, his, the children, the blood. The officer was patient and thorough and asked his questions carefully and thanked us when it was done. After that, nothing. No follow-up, no information, no call telling us what had been found or whether the car had been located or what had become of the woman with the blood on her shirt and the children in the back seat. The case closed around us and we were left outside of it, which is where people who make phone calls and give statements are left when the official world moves forward without them. That uncertainty has never resolved. I have never known whether she got out, whether the children are safe, whether the distance between that afternoon on the dam and her life now is a distance measured in recovery or in something worse. The not knowing is its own particular weight, different from grief, different from fear, more like a question that has been asked too many times to expect an answer, and has become simply a permanent resident in the back of the mind. What I think about most is not the chase, though the chase is vivid and accessible whenever I allow it to surface. What I think about is the moment she climbed out of the car, the calculation she made with her children in the back seat of his car, and her blood on her shirt, and two strangers in front of her who wanted to help but could not give her the thing she needed most, which was a version of this situation where the help did not come with consequences she would have to live with after we drove away. Domestic violence had existed for me before that afternoon, the way most things exist before they become personal, as a known fact about the world, as something that appeared in news stories and statistics and conversations held at a safe remove. And then it climbed into my car and bled on the seat and asked me to drive. And it became something that I have carried ever since as a physical memory, located in the body, in the hands that gripped the wheel and the chest, that held a heart that was pounding in a register it had not been designed for. I hope she is safe. I have hoped this for 10 years with the specific quality of hope that exists for things you cannot verify, things that have no update, things that ended for you at a farmhouse a mile down the road while the story continued for someone else. It is a quiet hope, maintained without expectation, the kind you keep not because it changes anything, but because setting it down entirely feels like a form of abandonment. The dam is still there. People still run along it, fish from its edges, bring their children to look at the water. It is still an ordinary road that locals use without thinking about it, the way you use places that have been familiar long enough to stop requiring attention. I think about her every time. There are stories that stay outside of you that you can pick up and set down, that exist at a manageable distance even when they are sad or terrible. You read them, you feel something, you carry on. And then there are stories that get inside you before you realize what is happening, that arrange themselves along the streets you drive every day and the landscapes you thought you knew, that attach themselves to faces you have actually seen and hands you have actually shaken. Daniel Morecambe's story is the second kind for me. It has never been something I could hold at arm's length. It was always too close, threaded too deeply into the fabric of ordinary life, woven into places and routines and faces in ways that made the distance that should exist between a person and a tragedy like this simply unavailable. I want to explain what I mean by that, but first I need to tell you what happened. Daniel was 13 years old. It was the lead up to Christmas, that particular time of year when the whole atmosphere of childhood feels animated by anticipation, when there are presents to think about and school is almost finished and the world has a warmth to it that makes ordinary things feel festive. He left his house to walk down to the bus stop near his home. He was going to catch the bus to the shops to buy Christmas presents for his family. This is the detail that I have never been able to move past without stopping. Christmas presents for his family. He was thinking about them. He was doing something kind. He was 13 years old and he was thinking about what to get the people he loved. And he walked down to the bus stop. And he never came home. The bus he was meant to take was delayed. He stood at the stop and waited. While he waited, a car pulled up. There were people around. This is important and I will come back to it. The abduction did not happen in an isolated place on a deserted road, in a location where the absence of witnesses was the condition of possibility. It happened in the open, in daylight, in a place with people nearby. Witnesses saw a boy being taken. Some saw him struggling. Some heard voices raised, and no one moved. Not because they were cowards, not because they did not care, but because of something more ordinary and more terrible than either of those things. They each believed that someone else would act. They looked at a situation that required a response, and they outsourced the response to the room, to the collective, to the assumed other adult who would surely step in, and in that collective assumption, in that gap between the responsibility everyone felt and the action no one took, Daniel was put into a car and driven away. He was 13 years old. It was the week before Christmas. He was thinking about presents for his family his parents spent 8 years not knowing. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because I think it is easy to read it and let it pass. 8 years, nearly a decade during which Bruce and Denise Morecambe woke up every morning into the same absence, the same unanswered question, the same suspended state of grief that could not complete itself, because without a body, without certainty, hope and despair existed simultaneously and with equal force. They went to prisons. They sat across from inmates and listened to things that no parent should ever have to hear. Rumors and stories and claimed knowledge about what had been done to their child. And they had no way to evaluate the truth of any of it. No way to know which details were real and which were the product of malice or manipulation or the particular cruelty of people who have already done the worst thing and find a secondary pleasure in the continuing of it. 8 years of that. 8 years of missing posters and memorials and candlelight vigils and the community holding a space for a child who might still be somewhere, who might still be found, who might still come home. 8 years of a grief that had no floor, that could not reach the bottom of itself because the information that would allow it to do so had been deliberately withheld. Eventually, a tip. Eventually, an arrest. The man who was taken in had 4 children of his own, which is the kind of detail that the mind turns away from, but cannot entirely avoid, because it says something about the capacity of the ordinary surface of a life to conceal whatever is living beneath it. He protected his accomplices even then, refused to give them up, but he told police what had happened to Daniel. The confession contained no motive in any sense that the word usually carries. There was no money involved, no personal history, no grievance being settled, no ideology being served. They had wanted to know what it was like to kill a child. When they saw Daniel at the bus stop, they saw an opportunity to find out. They abducted him, drove him to a forest, walked him deeper inside, but away from roads and light and any possibility of being heard. They cut off his ear, then they killed him. They left his remains in the bush and they drove away, and the forest closed over what they had done, and 8 years passed. When Daniel's remains were found, it did not bring peace. I want to be honest about that because I think there is a narrative that investigation and discovery and resolution offer something that functions like an ending, like a place where grief can finally land and begin the work of becoming something survivable. What the discovery brought was different. It brought answers which are not the same as comfort. It confirmed what hope had been holding at bay for 8 years. It gave the grief a floor, and the grief hit that floor hard. Now I need to explain why this is not, for me, a story about something that happened somewhere else to people I read about. I was born in the same town as the man who killed Daniel. That fact arrived in my life like something cold and physical when I understood it. The recognition that the geography of my earliest existence overlapped with the geography of his, that we had both drawn our first air in the same place. Later, my family moved. We moved to the state where Daniel had lived, to the area where he had been abducted, where his remains had been found. These were not locations I encountered on a map or in a news report. They were the streets I moved through, the landmarks I passed regularly enough that they had stopped registering as landmarks and had become background, the way everything familiar becomes background when you see it often enough. I met Daniel's parents more than once, both before and after his remains were found. I am aware that anything I say about this risks sounding like something it isn't, like a claim to grief that belongs to others, and I want to be careful about that. What I can say is what I saw. I saw people who were carrying something that should not fit inside a human life, and who were carrying it anyway, because there was no alternative, because the world had continued to require things of them, even after it had taken the thing that made those requirements bearable. They were kind. They were present. They were doing the impossible work of remaining in the world, while a piece of the world that had been theirs was permanently gone. Witnessing that kind of endurance is its own form of education, though not one anyone would choose. I attended Daniel's funeral. His twin brother carried the coffin. I have never found the words that are adequate to that image, and I have stopped trying to find them. There are things that exist beyond the reach of language, that resist being made into sentences, that, when you try to compress them into words, simply press back against the compression and remain what they are, which is unbearable. A boy carrying his twin's coffin is one of those things. I watched it happen, and I have never stopped watching it happen. Not really, because it is the kind of image that does not agree to become the past. It stays present in a way that most things do not. It insists on remaining close. Before I knew any of this, I had camped in the forest where Daniel's remains were found. I had been there. I had slept in that place, had moved through it in the ordinary way of a person moving through a piece of bush that is just a piece of bush, had experienced it as peaceful and unremarkable in the way that wilderness feels, peaceful and unremarkable when you have no knowledge of what has happened inside it. When I learned what that ground had held, the memory rearranged itself. The same images, the same sensory details of that place now existed inside a different frame, and the frame changed everything. The quality of the quiet was different in retrospect. The depth of the trees was different. What had been peaceful became something else entirely. and I understood for the first time how completely our experience of a place depends on what we know about it. How the same physical space can be two entirely different things, depending on the knowledge you bring to it. Now, every morning when I was driven to school, the route traced what I came to think of as a timeline. At the end of my street, the motel where those men had stayed. We passed it without comment, my family and I, but I knew what it was, and knowing was enough. Then the memorial at the bus stop, the place where Daniel had stood waiting, where the seconds had passed in which someone should have acted and did not, marked now with flowers and tributes. The community's attempt to leave something at the place where everything had been taken. And then the forest, just visible from the road, the trees that had received what those men had done and held it for 8 years without giving anything back. All of it on a single route. All of it passed every morning on the way to school. There was no version of ordinary that was available to me on those drives. No way to let the familiar become invisible again once you knew what the familiar contained. I was a child and then a teenager, trying to understand something that resists understanding, something that the mind keeps approaching from different angles in the hope that one of them will yield a way in, a point of comprehension that makes it possible to file the thing away and move on. The question that I could not stop returning to was the simplest and most impossible one. Why? Not why in the sense of motive, because the confession had already removed the comfort of motive. Why in the deeper sense of how the world had allowed this to be a thing that happened. How 3 people could look at a 13-year-old boy standing at a bus stop thinking about Christmas presents and arrive at the decision they arrived at. How that was a thing that human beings were capable of doing. How the category of human beings that contained Daniel's parents and Daniel's twin brother, and the community that lit candles and searched for 8 years, also contained the people who took him into a forest and did what they did. I have been sitting with that question for a long time. I do not have an answer. What I have instead is the understanding that the question is the point, that the refusal of evil to be comprehensible is itself a form of information about what evil is. It is not the dark version of something we understand. It is the thing that understanding fails against. It is what is left when all the frameworks we use to make the world navigable simply stop working. The bystander effect has a name and a clinical description and a body of psychological research behind it. And none of that makes it easier to sit with when you apply it to a specific afternoon and a specific bus stop, and a boy being put into a car while people nearby decided someone else would act. The research explains the mechanism. It does not explain the seconds themselves, the particular texture of each individual hesitation, the moment when each person chose, in whatever form that choice took, to wait. I think about those witnesses sometimes. I think about what they carried afterward, what it meant to them in the years that followed. Whether the knowledge of what had happened to Daniel changed their relationship to their own hesitation on that afternoon, whether they lay awake with it. I think they must have. I think that kind of knowledge does not agree to stay where you put it. What I am left with, after years of living in proximity to this story, and to the people whose lives it is actually made of, is not a lesson in any clean sense. Lessons imply a transaction, imply that the terrible thing has produced something usable, something that compensates even partially for what it cost. I don't think that's what this is. What it is instead is a permanent alteration in how I see ordinary things. A bus stop, a forest, a motel at the end of a street, the lead up to Christmas, that busy, hopeful time. A boy walking out of his house to do something kind for the people he loved. The ordinariness of the beginning of that day is what I cannot get past, even now. The way it started as something thousands of children do every day, the way it looked. From the outside, like nothing more than a boy going to the shops. The way there was nothing in any visible detail of that morning that suggested what was coming. That is the thing that stays. Not the horror of the ending, though the horror of the ending is always present. The normalcy of the beginning. The way the ordinary world contains these things inside it. Hidden, patient, indistinguishable from everything around them until the moment when they are not. The way Daniel's world looked like safety and was not safe. The way the forest looked like a forest and held what it held. There is a boy who should be alive. He would be in his mid-30s now. He might have children of his own. He might have given Christmas presents to his parents every year, and his parents might have complained lovingly about not needing anything while treasuring whatever he brought, the way parents do. His twin brother might not have had to carry something that no one should have to carry. There might have been an ordinary life, unremarkable and irreplaceable, unfolding across the years. That life did not happen. That is the center of this, the fact that cannot be softened or reframed or made to yield anything except the acknowledgement of its own weight. Daniel Morcombe was 13 years old. He was thinking about Christmas presents for his family. He walked to a bus stop on an ordinary morning, and he never came home. And the world, the same world where his parents woke up every day for 8 years into the same absence, the same world where his twin brother grew up without him, kept going, as worlds do, as they always do. Indifferently, relentlessly, as if nothing had been broken. Something had been broken. Something is still broken. I do not think it will be repaired. There is a version of my life that ended on the night before Easter in the late 1990s. I don't mean that as a figure of speech. I mean that there is a specific sequence of events that was already in motion that night, already assembling itself on a stretch of road I would have been on, and the only reason I wasn't on it comes down to something I still cannot explain and have stopped trying to explain in any satisfying way. It was a feeling, an ordinary, unremarkable, inexplicable feeling, and it kept me alive. College in those years had a particular texture that I can still access when I think hard enough. The busyness of it, the sense that everything was temporary and also permanent at the same time. That the friendships and the routines and the late nights were both something you were passing through and something that would last forever. I was juggling classes and papers and a social life that felt essential in the way only a 20-year-old's social life feels essential. And two of my closest friends were sisters who lived on the outskirts of town, far enough that getting there required a minor commitment, not just a walk down the street. I had known them for long enough that their house had become one of the places that felt like an extension of my own. The kind of place you could appear at without warning, walk into the kitchen, sit down, and find yourself deep in conversation about nothing and everything before you had quite registered that the evening had begun. Both of them worked at Pizza Hut. The younger one as a cook, the older one training as a manager. Their schedules ran late, especially on weekends, but they had a gift for making time feel elastic, for making you feel like there was always room at the table and always something worth talking about. The night before Easter that year, I was alone in my room, working on a paper due the following Monday. This was before laptops had become the assumed standard. So I was typing on a word processor, saving carefully and often, the way you do when you have experienced enough technological betrayal to no longer take a saved document for granted. I had been at it for hours and reached the stage of staring where the words stop looking like words and become arrangements of letters with no particular meaning. My brain had arrived at its limit and was signaling this by making everything I had written seemed simultaneously adequate and irredeemably flat. I needed a break, not just a change of position or a glass of water, but a genuine interruption. the kind that comes from leaving the room and being somewhere else for a while. The sisters came to mind immediately, as they often did when I needed exactly that kind of easy, undemanding company. I thought about the kitchen table, the particular quality of their house at night, the way an hour there could reset something in me that solitary breaks could not. I decided to go. I closed down the word processor. I got up, changed my clothes, ran something through my hair, made myself look like a person who had made a deliberate choice to go out rather than one who had been defeated by a paper. The getting ready process took about half an hour, which was nothing unusual. There was no urgency and no anxiety in it. I was not troubled, not particularly tired in any meaningful way, not fighting any resistance. I was simply a person preparing to visit friends, performing the ordinary steps in the ordinary order, my mind already half at their kitchen table. I put on my shoes. I pulled on my coat. I checked the time. I walked to my bedroom door, reached out, and closed my hand around the doorknob. What happened next is the part that has never resolved itself into language that feels adequate to it. In the time it takes to draw a single breath, something changed. Not gradually, not in the way tiredness creeps up on you over an evening and becomes undeniable only when you stand up and feel your legs. This was immediate. A wave of exhaustion, total and heavy, that seemed to arrive from outside rather than rising from within, as though something had reached in and removed whatever it is that makes you capable of moving forward. Every intention I had of opening that door and walking through it simply ceased to be available, not suppressed, not reconsidered, gone. I stood there with my hand on the knob and the coat on my back and my shoes on my feet, and I could not explain what I was feeling. I remember the confusion of it, the mild, detached puzzlement of a person whose body has just done something unexpected without consulting them. I was not frightened. I was not receiving any message that I interpreted as significant. I was just standing at a door I suddenly lacked the capacity to open. Yeah, and after a moment I shrugged at myself in the way you do when something minor doesn't add up, and I let go. I hung up the coat. I took off the shoes. I went back to the desk, but my eyes wouldn't find the paper again, so I gave up and went to bed. The decision registered as nothing. A small, mildly strange moment in an ordinary Saturday night, the kind that vanishes completely unless something happens later to call it back. The phone call came the next morning. I knew before the words arrived from the quality of the voice, from the particular way a person breathes when they are carrying something too heavy to set down gently. The sisters had been in a crash. The older one was gone, dead on impact. The younger one was alive, but the word the caller used alongside alive was the kind of word that makes alive sound like its own kind of damage. I sat with the phone in my hand after the call ended and looked at the wall. The information was there, completely assembled, grammatically clear, and I could not make it real. The mind does that with certain things. It receives them and processes them and cannot convert them into the form that allows you to feel them all at once. You feel them in pieces over time in the days and weeks that follow, as the reality of the thing keeps arriving in small, unbearable installments. The details came out over the following hours and days. The younger sister had been working that night. Her shift ended around 1 in the morning. She didn't have a car. The older sister, who had the night off, had done what she always did on those nights. She had gone to pick her up, the simple act of an older sister who took care of things. They were on their way home when it happened. The crash was not a fender collision, not the kind of accident you walk away from shaken and grateful. It was the other kind. The impact was catastrophic. The older sister never had a chance. The detail that came later, offered by someone who had it from the emergency responders, was the one I have never been able to fully put down. When they arrived at the car, the older sister's hands were gripped around the steering wheel so tightly, the reflex of those final seconds locked into her muscles that they could not remove them. They had to break her fingers to get her free. I have never stopped being able to picture that, the specific image of it, now what those final moments must have held for her, the awareness arriving just fast enough to tighten her hands, and then the nothing after. The younger sister survived. This is not a small thing. Survival in her case required extraordinary medical intervention and a recovery that lasted, in one form or another, for years. Her pelvis was shattered. She did not walk for more than 12 months. One of the things the doctor said, in the careful language of medical professionals, finding something in a terrible situation that functions as explanation, was that she may have survived in part because she had fallen asleep in the car. Her body was relaxed in the moment of impact. Whether that is fully true or simply the most available comfort, I don't know. But it was true that she slept in cars easily, had always fallen asleep on long rides, and that this small, ordinary habit may have been the difference between the story she got to keep living and the one her sisters ended on. It was not until the shape of the night had been fully drawn for me that I understood where I had been standing in it. If I had gone, if I had opened that door, walked down to my car, made the drive out to their house on the outskirts of town, I would have been there when the older sister left to pick up the younger one from her shift. There is no version of that in which I don't go with her. That is simply not how it worked among us. You were there, you went together. That was the rhythm of things. I would have been in the front seat or the back seat of that car, on that road, in that impact. Based on what happened to the older sister, I would not have survived. This is not a dramatic conclusion I am reaching for. It is the arithmetic of the situation, laid out plainly. The older sister was in the driver's seat and died instantly. I would have been a passenger, and the crash that killed the driver and shattered the pelvis of a person who was relaxed at the moment of impact would not have left room for a third person to walk away from. I would have been 20 years old, and I would have been done. I have sat with this knowledge for more than 20 years now. In the early period, it was acute, the kind of awareness that interrupts ordinary activities, that makes a cup of coffee feel surreal, because you are holding it and your hand is attached to your body, and your body is present in a morning that you should not, by the logic of one specific night, have lived to see. The guilt came with it, but the guilt that survivors carry that has no satisfying logic but does not require logic to be real. Why her and not me? Why me and not her? The questions that don't have answers but ask themselves anyway, loudly, at inconvenient times, for longer than you expect. The thing that settled into something permanent, something that has not gone away in the way the acute pain eventually went away, is the memory of standing at the door, the coat on my back, the shoes on my feet, my hand on the knob. 30 minutes of preparation, no hesitation, a decision made and acted upon, and then a single breath in which something removed my ability to follow through. Nothing dramatic, no vision, no voice, no clear signal that could be pointed to and named. Just a feeling that arrived suddenly and completely and changed the night. I have thought about this from enough angles to have exhausted most of the explanations. Ordinary exhaustion, accumulated over a long week and triggered finally by the act of standing up and preparing to go out. The body asserting a need that the conscious mind had not registered yet. Coincidence pure and simple, a moment of fatigue that happened to occur at a moment that happened to matter. I cannot rule any of these out. I also cannot make them feel complete. They explain the mechanism maybe, but they don't explain the quality of it, the totality of it, the way it arrived, like something from outside rather than rising from within. The older sister had said, over the years, more than once, in the casual way of something that has become a recurring joke. That isn't quite a joke, that she wouldn't live to see 30. And people who knew her had heard it enough times that it had become part of how they thought about her. One of those things a person says that everyone files away without taking seriously. She died 1 month before her 30th birthday. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to do with any of it, not in the sense of making it cohere into something that explains itself. What I have instead is the memory of a doorknob and a coat, and 30 minutes of ordinary preparation and of feeling that stopped me with my hand already reaching. What I have is a friend who is gone and a younger sister who eventually walked again, and a morning after phone call that rearranged the way I understood the relationship between small decisions and large outcomes. Some nights, even now, I find myself thinking about the version of that night where I pushed through the feeling, where I told myself I was being ridiculous, opened the door, walked to my car, made the drive, where I sat at their kitchen table and talked and then rode along to pick up the younger sister, because of course I would have, and the road came up to meet us all, and that was the end of the story I was in. That version of the night is real in some way I can't fully dismiss. It was the version that was in progress, that had been planned, that required only the turning of a knob to begin. What stopped it was nothing I can name with confidence, nothing I would know how to reproduce or recognize in advance. I know only that I let go of the doorknob, that I took off my shoes and hung up my coat and went to bed, and that in the morning the world was still a place I was in. I have never fully understood why. I have stopped expecting to.